Okay, friends. So I welcome I welcome Dr. Valeria Bizzari to our Friday philosophy seminar series. And let me introduce Dr. Valeria. She has done PhD from University of Heidelberg in the area of intersubjectivity and in autism spectrum disorder. And then she has also done postdoc from Oxford University, I guess with Dan Zahavi. Uh, am I right, Dr. Valeria?
No, within the Oxford Empathy Program,
On empathy program. Okay.
there is an
But was
Oxford
it,
an empathy.
yeah, in empathy program. Okay. So today she would be, her title is like in a shell. So as we were already discussing that how psychopathology is developed when there is disruption in the relationship with others. So her talk is philosophically speaking grounded in phenomenological school of philosophy, and this school of philosophy gives emphasis on experience, which I think is quite missing in other schools like analytical school of philosophy. So that is one important aspect. And here, as Heidegger informs us that human existence is characterized by the term Dasein, which means being out there. It's not that there is an isolated consciousness. So when our humanity, our human existence is fundamentally characterized in our relationship with world, with others, then it is understandable that psychopathology would be developed as a result of disruption or interruption in this very basic relationship with otherness or the world. So in that backdrop, she has been working as well and would be giving her talk. So I welcome. So please, Dr. Valeria, you go ahead with your talk. Well, thank
Okay, thanks a lot. I want to thank you again for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, as you suggested, I will focus on intersubjectivity from a phenomenological perspective. I hope you can see my slide presentation. Can you see it?
I cannot
Can you see
see.
my slide?
No, no, I cannot. What about others?
No?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
It's visible.
Yeah, we
Yes?
can see.
I can see. Okay. Okay, go ahead. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, because it's the first time I use Google Meet. So as I said, my presentation will be divided in three main parts. So the first part will describe different accounts of intersubjectivity in classical phenomenology. Then I will contextualize these accounts within the contemporary debate on intersubjectivity. And then I will focus on a specific intersubjective disruption, that is autism spectrum disorder. So I will try to understand why sometimes intersubjectivity seems not to work. So the main question concerning intersubjectivity that worries philosophers is the so-called problem of other minds. That is, how do I know, or how can I justify the belief that other beings exist who have thoughts, feelings, and other mental attributes? And of course, I cannot explain all of the answers given to this quite important problem, but today I will focus on the phenomenological answers, on phenomenological tradition. I will start with Heidegger. As you anticipated, Heidegger gave a very important contribution to this topic. And his treatment of intersubjectivity is to be found in the context of his analysis of our being in the world. More specifically, this is in connection with an analysis of our practical engagement in the surrounding world that Heidegger addresses the issue of others, because he noticed that the world we are engaged in is not a private one, but a public and communal one. So according to Heidegger, the type of entities we first and foremost encounter in our daily life are not natural objects, but artifacts. And it's a fundamental feature of these entities that they all contain references to other persons. And this is interesting because very recently I read a paper by Vittorio Gallese. Vittorio Gallese is a neuroscientist, but I think that he wrote something very consistent with this Heideggerian view, because he claims for the overcoming of the dualism between nature and culture, because also from a neuroscientific perspective, it supports a biocultural paradigm. So to say, he claims that our brain is a plastic, a dynamic organ, and that is influenced by the environment, and then the environment is a cultural entity as well. So there is a sort of reciprocity between the individual, also the individual as a brain, so already from a neuroscientific level, and the cultural environment. In Heideggerian terms, we can claim that our Dasein is essentially social and is immediately related to the world. So in this case, it seems that the problem of other minds is not a problem at all, because Dasein cannot be understood except as inhabiting a world which it necessarily shares with others. And Heidegger is by no means the only phenomenologist to advocate this kind of approach to intersubjectivity. We will see related arguments in Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, because these authors fully recognize that we are embedded in a living tradition. So I live in a world which is permeated by references to others, and which others have already furnished with meaning. A related author which differs from Heidegger, even if it starts from a similar conception, is Sartre. In a very schematic manner, we can claim that while in Heidegger we have a sociality which is in a way distributed within the world, that is already there in the world, Sartre claims that we should emphasize the role of the concrete other and of our meeting with the other, even if it's undeniable that tools and artifacts contain references to a plurality of embodied others. So as Heidegger, he argues that our daily activities are intrinsically social and reveal our participation in a community of subjects, even in the encounter with concrete others. So to live in a world which is shared with my fellow men is not only to be able to encounter the other, but also to find myself engaged in a world in which instrumental complexes can have a meaning, which my free project has not first given to them. But to Sartre, Heidegger's notions of being with, so our Mitsein, fails to capture our original and fundamental relation to others. So the emphasis here is on the individual, which meets the others. Because we should not ignore the most crucial features of intersubjectivity, that is the relation to radical otherness. And it's crucial to distinguish between the other, which I perceive, and the other which perceives me. So there is this sort of tension in the concrete meeting. And Sartre takes intersubjectivity to be, first of all, a question of conflict and confrontation, and not of coexistence, we can say. So the existence of others is a contingent fact, and our being for others must be understood as an existential dimension which only arises in and through my encounter, my concrete encounter with factual others, so with the real others. What is important here to notice? It's important to notice that thanks to Sartre, we can observe the duality of human beings. So the fact that we are not only subject of perception, but also object of perception. Just think about the importance that Sartre attributes to the look of the others. I feel myself looked by the others, and I understand that I am an object. And in the same line, we can find Levina's approach. So according to Levina, the problem of intersubjectivity is, like in Sartre perspective, a problem of radical otherness. So Levina denies that any form of intentionality, of openness towards the world, including intersubjectivity, will ever permit us to understand others, to understand fully our meetings. In his view, we cannot reduce the other to something that is not, that is a mere object, is a complex object. And we engage in a non-reciprocal relationship. So foreign subjectivity is exactly that which cannot be conceptualized or categorized. I claim, I quote, if one could possess, grasp, and know the other, it would not be the other. So we will see that also in Husserl, this sort of gap between myself and the other I am going to perceive is something very important, because for both of them, if I will ever completely grasp otherness, we will have lost otherness. So otherness is something that in a way remains a little bit hidden for us. So whereas Sartre and Levina chose to view the problem of intersubjectivity, the problem of other minds, as a problem concerning the encounter with a radical otherness, and whereas both Sartre and Levina argued that this meeting is so overwhelming, is so difficult, that is something the subject is unprepared for and has no chance of anticipating, we find the opposite perspective in classical phenomenologists such as Scheler, Merleau-Ponty, and Husserl. All of these authors are concerned with an analysis of the condition of possibility for intersubjectivity, that is, with an investigation into the question of how a relationship between subjects is possible. I will start with Scheler, and I wanted to underline a couple of things in Scheler. The first one is his peculiarity, in my view, that is the priority he gives to the we dimension. So according to Scheler, we live or we are already born in a we social dimension. The other peculiarity is the centrality of the role of embodiment, and it's important to to tell you that starting from this point of the presentation, I will emphasize a lot the role of embodiment in intersubjective understanding. So, according to Scheler, in the face-to-face meeting, we are not confronted with a mere body, nor with an hidden psyche, but with a unified whole. So a solution to the problem of other minds, in his view, must start with a correct understanding of the relation between mind and body. So when I see a foreign face, for instance, I see it as friendly or angry. That is, it's the face that expresses these emotions, and that I don't have to think about it. I immediately grasp them. Moreover, bodily behavior, so bodily gestures, it's already meaningful, it's intentional, and as such is neither internal or external, but is beyond this artificial distinction. So for this reason, we should realize that the body of the other differs radically from inanimate objects, for instance. It's very different to perceive a flower and to perceive another person. And that our perception of this body is quite unlikely our perception of ordinary things. So we perceive the other as a unified expressing whole, as an animated body. And for Scheller, bodily manifestations are by no means the key to other individualities, which would immediately present themselves as foreign. Rather, at the beginning, there is a flow of experience in which I and you are not differentiated but mixed. So only later these differences take shape. So to summarize, we have a general ego, and wherever there is an experience, there is a general ego. So in this sense, in Schellerian thought, man lives more originally in the community than in his individual self. And it's interesting to notice that this is one of the most important points where Scheller is completely different from Husserlian perspective, because while Scheller asks himself, how do the different egos communicate? Husserl ask himself, how do the different egos are separated? So on the one hand, with Scheller, we have an individual who lives immediately in a we dimension, in a community. According to Husserl, there is a transcendental ego, an individual, a monad that develops and gradually becomes social with different shapes of sociality, we will see, of course. So the concept on which Husserl relies is the reduction to the self, with which he describes the ego as the center of orientation, Ikzentrierung, which through the body take their position in the world and are different here and now. So for this reason, Husserl argues that it's impossible to experience the same experiences while maintaining the usual space-time perspective. Every person is a here and now, occupies a specific place in time and space. So it's impossible to perceive at the same time the same things, for instance. And this position is, on the one hand, consistent with what Leuven argued, but is also completely opposed to Scheller dimensions. But with Scheller, Husserl emphasizes the role of the body. I wanted to start with the role of the body also in Husserl, because I think it's quite important and quite innovative, because when we usually think about Husserl, we are used to think about him as a philosopher who is really demanding towards the transcendental dimension. But if we carefully read his text, especially Ideas 2, but I am also thinking about some unpublished manuscript on intersubjectivity. We realize that he's describing an individual who is embedded in the world with a living body. Husserl introduces the distinction between the body as object and the body as subject in Ideas 2, in the section from 35 to 42. And he described a body as a psychophysical whole, so a body which is inextricably entangled with the psyche. And being a lived body, in his view, allows not only for self-consciousness, but also for the experience of the alterity. Because others, in his view, are implied in my perceptual activity before a concrete face-to-face meeting. So in Husserlian literature, we find two descriptions of intersubjectivity. The first one is the most basic one. the intersubjective structure of experience, which is present before the concrete encounter with the alterity. And then we have the meeting with the others, which happens thanks to empathy. So in the first kind of sociality, we have a subject that perceives the world. For instance, I am in front of my computer at this moment, and I am aware that even if I don't see it, my computer also has a back. And when I perceive it, I perceive not only one side of it, I apperceive, I co-intention also the hidden side, as if I were another here and now, as if I saw them from a different perspectives. This is basically the very first kind of intersubjectivity, our openness, or as Zavi described it, our open subjectivity. So perception is never exhausted in the short term, but it's an original reference structure for potential anonymous co-perceivers. And these implicit co-perceivers are characterized by perception abilities, of course, and are necessarily embodied. So we can claim that in order to be perceived, the environment or an object must be visible, tangible, and so on and so forth to everyone, or I would say to everybody, not only to our own individuality. So this is the very first openness in respect to otherness. And we can notice that here we still have the priority of the individual in any case, because in this respect, otherness is an eidetic variation of myself. But otherness is not a mere change of myself, something possible. It's an actual modification. So the first true transcendence occurs only when the other appears within the field of perception of the subject as a concrete psychophysical being. So we had first our perception of the object, but now we are meeting a real other. What does it happen? Through the libe, so through the fact that I am a living body, otherness is constituted as a new form of reality, recognized as analogous thanks to the similarities between my body and the other's body. So being embodied is essential, we can say. Only through the libe can I enter into the field of perception of the other, which in turn recognize me as a libe analogon, as a body very similar to his body, as a corporeality which finds its expression in an individuality. So I recognize that your body is expressive and this is similar to mine, and vice versa. And this special kind of experience is empathy. And we should know that in the semester between 1928 and 1929, the Husserl's last semester, his final class, Husserl had a seminar exclusively on empathy. This is very important to underline the fact of how empathy and intersubjectivity, especially at the end of his career, was so important to him and worthy of further study. And the similarity of the other's bodies, Husserl says, motivates the analogy through which I attribute to the other a live, living body like mine. A bit, of course, different from it. So we perceive the other not just a mere object, but as a subject like me. This is the very important shift. And this procedure is embodied and takes place starting from the observation of other's body and of his movements, because we are a moving body. Within the contemporary debate, I feel to suggest you Maxine Sheets Johnson papers, because she emphasized the kinesthetic side of the body and the fact that we explore and we know the world through our moving body. So with a practical engagement and not a mental representation. So we perceive the other body. We notice that the body of the other is very similar to mine. And there is at this point a mechanism that Husserl described as Paarung, that is association. This remains in the domain of the passive synthesis, and it's original, immediate, active, effective. And we can claim that, according to Husserl, the other is not perceived through logical reasoning, but through a passive movement. Also in Ideas 2, which is the most important text in my view, especially if we want to study intersubjectivity, passive synthesis is not a preparation, but it's a way in itself of perceptual organization. So the bond with the other is inside passivity, is not something representational or categorical, because I recognize the other immediately as a living, animated body, which is expression of subjectivity. Husserl's works was very important, and we can claim that Merleau-Ponty, the other main important phenomenologist, developed his thought starting from Husserl's description. In Merleau-Ponty, the problem of other minds is declined in three different problems, actually. So we have the conceptual problem. So how can I attribute subjectivity to another I? How can I ascribe meaning to otherness? Then we have the epistemological problem. How do I know the other? And then we have the empirical feature of intersubjectivity. How do I interpret the mental states of others from a practical point of view? How can the functioning of mechanism related to interpersonality be described? Of course, these problems are related to one another. So they can be considered as separately or together in a phenomenological investigation. But they are very important to describe intersubjectivity. So the basic problems, how can I ascribe meaning to otherness? And the second one, especially the epistemological problems, are deeply interrelated, because the first one concerned the perception of alterity as such. From the outset, I understand that the other is not a mere moving object, and therefore it's the reason why I try, second point, to understand him. Because if I thought that the other is an object, I wouldn't care about what he's thinking or what he's feeling. So as the very core of perceptual activity, the answers given by Merleau-Ponty is quite consistent with what we have described until now, because he claims that the body is the instrument thanks to which there can be a link between the subject, the word, the ego, and the alter ego. And in order to analyze things, he uses the notion of intercorporeality, a pre-reflective and lived-in type of knowledge that allows the subject to recognize the other in an immediate and pre-reflective, non-thetic manner. So the body seems to be the place of the emergence of shared meanings. In the case of an intersubjective meeting, intercorporeality is that pre-reflective intertwining of lived and living bodies that resonate with one another without requiring inferential capacities. So we have this mutual bodily synchrony that allows two subjects to experience subjective and objective qualities through their lived bodies. Another manner to describe this meeting is offered by the notion of motor intentionality. That is this pre-reflective kind of knowledge that allows the subject to recognize the other in an immediate manner. So more specifically concerning intersubjectivity, Merleau-Ponty claims that the experience of self necessarily presupposes the experience of otherness. So what is at stake is an embodied subjectivity whose main feature, whose main aspect, is the involving of an alterity. Let's think about the so-called bilaterality of kinesthesia. I touch my hand with my hand. So in this way, touching myself, I anticipate the manner in which the other would experience me, but also the way through which I could experience him. So this reciprocal dimension. I prepared myself, I quote from Merleau-Ponty, for understanding that there are other animalia and possibly other men. So in this view, our embodied self-awareness is a sort of echo of our intercorporeal constitution. In a Phenomenology of Perception, that is his masterpiece, Merleau-Ponty faces this issue, especially in the chapter The Other and the Human Being, and the Human World, sorry. But we can also find an interesting contribution in the course Les relations avec autrui chez l'enfant, where he analyzes the psychoanalytic perspective and some developmental theories according to which we can talk about the perception of the alterity in psychogenetic terms. So what does it mean? It means that according to Merleau-Ponty, we are social creatures from birth because we possess a corporeal schema. And it's interesting to notice that an experimental study conducted by Melzoff and Moore has shown that newborns, the youngest 42 minutes old and the oldest 72 hours old, are able to imitate facial expression. So we born and we are able to imitate others, because we have an inner capacity very similar to what Merleau-Ponty described as corporeal schema, which creates a bridge between interiority and exteriority. So as Zavi noted in a wonderful paper, Beyond Empathy, all of these phenomenological perspectives, so Heidegger, Sartre, Leuven, Scheler, Husserl, and Merleau-Ponty, of course, are quite different from one another, but they share some common theses. So the first one is that intersubjectivity is something pre-categorial and pre-linguistic. And this is one of the decisive differences between the phenomenological approach and the approach that we find, for instance, in Habermas, who argues that language is the foundation of intersubjectivity. For phenomenology, language is something that comes after our intuitive understanding of others. Then we can claim that they all share the thesis according to which intersubjectivity cannot be analyzed through a third-person approach. On the contrary, it must be understood as a relation between subjects observable in the first person and second person. And that we can claim that intersubjectivity requires a relation between subject and word. Especially in Merleau-Ponty, that is strongly influenced by Gestalt psychology, we can find the view according to which intersubjectivity is possible if and only if the subject sees himself as embodied in a word, and a word defined as a common field of experience. So Merleau-Ponty phenomenological analysis of intersubjectivity seems to go far beyond solving the problem of understanding other minds, because it's not just about the mere face-to-face meeting between acting subjects, but is something that is also at stake in perception and in the very mode of human existence. And another schematic summarizing approach we can have at this point is the following. This schema will be quite important for the last part of my talk, we will see how this phenomenological description, these classical phenomenological authors are very useful also for the understanding psychopathologies. In a very schematic manner, of course, we can claim that there are different levels of intersubjectivity. Co-subjectivity, that is the implicit reference to alterity, which is postulated in the perceptual experience. The effective meeting with the other person, which allows for the analogy and the perceptive transposition. The effective meeting with the other also has the effect of destabilizing the ego, because I understand I am only one monad, one orientation center among others, and not the only one. Another effect of the face-to-face meeting, and for instance of the perception of the shared perception of the same object, is the fact that the world becomes objective, because it's conceived as something existing independently from the subject. There is this concordance. Husserl uses this very nice word, in my view, concordance of view. So we are all watching the same object. Our perception are concordant, so the world gains objectivity. It's not something that I see only by myself. This could be an hallucination, but hallucination is not objective at all. And then we have the anonymous community, that it can also be defined as a sensus communis, and which involves norms, values, and shared cultural issues. Of course, this is a very complex level of intersubjectivity, and it also implies a sense of belonging to a community or a group that transcends the individual while permeating every moment of his life. So I am always, I don't know, part of the group Italian, even when I am eating. Is something that is implicit in my subjectivity. So it seems clear that intersubjectivity is not a mere meeting with another individual, but it involves many different experiences whose primary ground is the capability to communicate and to conceive other subjects completely different from ourselves. So we don't have to project ourselves into the other, or vice versa. We are still differentiating ourselves from other. So why all of these theories are important nowadays, especially within the debate on intersubjectivity? So today we have two main theories, I would say, simulation theory and theory. According to these theories, our intersubjective understanding can be described as an internal simulation in the first case, or as an inferential and merely mental process in the latter case. In contrast to both of these tendencies, many authors, such as Gallagher and Zavi, just to mention two of them, developed an interactionist theory. They draw on the work of classical phenomenology, so they rely on the background that I just described, and they claim that our intersubjectivity amounts to an interpersonal exchange between two subjects as necessarily incorporated. So we have a direct and bodily perception of others that cannot be reduced neither to an internal simulation nor to an inferential and mental process. I would like to quote Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein says we see emotion as opposed to what? We don't see facial contortions and make the inference that is feeling joy, grief, boredom. We describe a face immediately as sad, radiant, bored, even when we are unable to give any other description of the features. So grief, one would like to say, is personified in the face. This is essential to what we call emotion. End of the quote. I think that this description given by Wittgenstein is consistent with phenomenology, because we have seen how in phenomenology the body assumes a fundamental cognitive function and is considered the true core of perceptual activity, the medium that allows the subject to establish a contact with the world and with the alter ego. So in this perspective, intersubjectivity is an interactive process and not a cognitive one. So in my encounter with the other, I am not an observer, but I am responding in an embodied way, something very dynamical, very practical. So social cognition is synonymous for social interaction, a process in which body movements, expression, and context play a key role. So it's clear how a representational account of cognition is not sufficient to explain the complexity of our intersubjective life. Quoting Gallagher, it's necessary to make cognition even more embodied. According to him, simulation theories and theory theories are in fact characterized by the following gaps. First of all, they miss experience. The role of experience is undervalued in favor of propositional attitudes and neural models. On the contrary, recent studies have shown that since childhood, we have seen the study by Mezzoff and Moore, our neural system is constantly modified by social interaction and it's constantly evolving. Then we have missing interaction because both simulation theory and theory theory consider social interaction a specialized skill which can be placed in the mind or in the brain of the individual. Instead, phenomenology focuses on the intentional opening between two agents and not on a relationship exclusively unique. It's not something hidden in the individual being in his imaginative or brain activity, but is something that is in between individuals. And then we have a missing embodiment, of course. Both theory and simulation theory do not take into account the role of corporeality, except, of course, for the mirror neural simulation process. So in this way, they seem to postulate that intersubjectivity is a sort of meeting between two disembodied agents. So I would like to give you also a neuroscientific perspective on this point, because we can ask ourselves, okay, which kind of body is at stake at this point in intersubjectivity, a brain or a living body? And an important discovery in the field of neurosciences, a discovery that, in my view, changed our view on intersubjectivity, but also emphasized how much important and how much intersubjectivity is essentially a feature of our humanities, of our human being, was mirror neuron system. This discovery, the discovery of mirror neurons, was made at the University of Parma, where I studied for my master and bachelor degree, in 1991 by Rizzolatti and Fogassi, who, following experiments, first on monkeys, on macaque and bonobos, and then on humans, located neurons within the motor system that are designed to understand the action of others and even their intentions. In experiments in which the monkey was free from conditioning and could act freely, a certain type of neuron was found to be present, which was activated both when the monkey performed a certain action, for instance, drinking a glass of water or picking a fruit, and when the monkey observed the experimenter perform a similar action. So even in the case I only observe an action, my neural mechanism are activated. Of course, the intensity is different, but they work as if I would perform this action myself. So the main differences between mirror neurons and other neurons in the premotor cortex is that mirror neurons are not activated by the simple presentation of objects, but by acts. We need activities. So an agent who performs activity that involve an interaction between the person and the object involved. Recent developments in the mirror neurons study have shown that they are activated also in art fruition. So also when imagination is at stake. And I think this is amazing, and I suggest you to read Vittorio Gallese papers on this topic, also because I think that his papers are more philosophical than many philosophical ones. But I think that, of course, we cannot say, okay, we discover mirror neurons and we find out what empathy really amounts to, what intersubjectivity really amounts to. There is something more complex at stake. Because, of course, we should remember that intersubjectivity, as we have described, involves many different layers and many different kind of complexity. So mirror system, according to Gallagher, can be described as a process based, of course, on experience and on the fact that we are embodied and acting subject. And we can also claim that this discovery constitutes a fundamental event in the debate on intersubjectivity, because it has shown that understanding others is not something based on linguistic and inferential processes, but it's also made clear from a phenomenological perspective the limits of the simulationist approach, which is too sterile to account for the complexity of empathic experience. Why we can see both the limit of theory and simulation theory. But, well, in the first case, of course, mirror neurons.
Sorry for Dr. Valerie. Since we are left with 10 minutes only, so I would request you to, if you can summarize and focus more on psychopathological aspect. That would be,
Okay,
I think.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
I will.
So how the disruption
Yeah.
in intersubjectivity leading to
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, because we have seen how much is complicated to account for intersubjectivity. So, in my view, neither a brain perspective or a inferential perspective on intersubjectivity can account for this multi-layered experience. So I propose a comprehensive analysis, which is basically the kind of analysis that I usually apply to psychopathology, and which comprehends 3 levels of explanation. The first one is, of course, the pre-phenomenal one, so the neurobiological substrate. This is the reason why I briefly sketched an account of mirror neurons hypothesis. Then we need also, in my view, a transphenomenal account. So an explanation not directly experienced by the subject, so to say, and then a phenomenal account that focus on lived experiences, so on the first person perspective, we can say. And in my work, basically, I ask myself, okay, what does it happen when intersubjectivity does not work? And as Thomas Fuchs suggests, a mental illness, a mental pathology, seems to be always a disturbance of the patient's experiential relation to others. So the feature that every kind of mental disorders involved is a detachment from the social domain, we can claim. Of course, this disruption occurs at different levels according to the pathology. And nowadays, this close relationship between mental disorders and impaired sociality is reflected in a growing body of research, both in the phenomenological field, but also in a more clinical perspective. I am thinking, for instance, about Schillbach work on autism in this case. Ample evidences indicate that the discrepancies in establishing intersubjective engagement in subjects with mental pathologies involve loss of social capacities and predispositions, such as joint attention and collective intentionality, and the loss of these properties of human intersubjectivity impairs the capacity to cooperate with others and prevents the patients from attaining crucial social affordances, such as the ability to share intentions and emotions, or the capacity itself to feel part of a group. Nonetheless, whether the patient's capacity to engage with others involves primary social perceptual anomalies or amounts to difficulties in participating in communal activities, it seems that these shortages stem from a fundamental disturbance at the intersubjective level. So we have a disturbance at the very core of subjectivity, which of course has consequences in the higher abilities of the subject. And a pathology that I have taken into account is autism spectrum disorder. That is a social pathology par excellence, of course, because autism basically involves the inability to engage with the social realm. Autistic people are not able to understand other emotions, for instance, but also to express their own emotion to others. So there is a sort of gap between self and others that hinders any kind of social activity, from the simplest one to the more complex one. Autism was identified in the 1940s, and during this time it piqued the interest of many researchers concerned with what it's as its core. And on the one hand, numerous theories have conceived it as a cognitive disorder, and basically they are the so-called theory of mind that we have seen. So according to this theory, an autistic subject is not able to understand the other because is not able to mentally infer and represent others' intentions or emotions. Other theories described it as an affective deficit and behavioral deficit, which prevents the subject from being interested in the world. And we can link these theories to simulation theories. And we have, in any case, a wide debate about autism. Of course, I won't explain each of these models because we don't have time and it's not interesting for our discussion, but it's sufficient for us to notice that all of these theories in this slide oscillates between theory and simulation theory, and also neurobiological perspective. So basically, we have theories according to which autism is a mental deficit, a cognitive mental deficit, and other theories such as the broken mirror neuron hypothesis or the predictive coding perspective, according to which autism is caused by a disruption in our brain. And that's it. So I think that as philosophers, we know that it's not so easy. We cannot claim that intersubjectivity is only empathy. So we cannot describe the intersubjectivity only through one of the levels we described in the first part of this lecture, but we cannot neither claim that an intersubjective deficit is caused only by a neural disruption. It's not so easy. And this is why I think that philosophy is so important for understanding and support psychopathology. To be an autistic child means to be incapable of establishing meaningful social communication, to establish visual contact with the world of others, to share attention with others, to be incapable to imitate others' behavior or to understand others' intentions and emotions, while sensation experience difficulties or even the impossibility to orient on the basis of cues provided by others. So autistic subjects are highly impaired in recognizing human faces, in displaying imitative behaviors, and all of these manifestations share a common root. The skills required to establish meaningful bonds with others are missing or impaired. So a phenomenological account seems to be important to understand the different layers through which intersubjectivity is impaired. And Gallagher has proposed an interactionist theory, as we described before. So a vision of intersubjectivity as a multi-layered experience that could be divided into primary or secondary intersubjectivity. So I would briefly sketch how these dimensions are corrupted in autism. And they work as an avalanche effect, so to say. So if primary intersubjectivity does not work, of course, I would not be able to develop complex intersubjective abilities, and for instance, to feel part of a group. So in the case of primary intersubjectivity, I refer here to the first sign of reciprocation. So whereas Merleau-Ponty describes the mother-infant relationship, the fact that we are since the beginning able to imitate others' behavior and so on and so forth. So at this level, we can sometimes we can already found a disruption, and we can observe in newborns some disruption. So at this stage, of course, having a theory of mind is not contemplated, nor does it appear useful. So the other is perceived as an intentional being like me. And this capacity allows the infant to interpret the body movements of the others. We have a nice description of from Baron Cohen that describe the ability, for instance, to follow the gaze of others and consider its significance. And we can also link this description with Schillerian theory, because we can argue that bodily and motor elements allow the subject to establish this initial connection with otherness. So here we are at the level of primary intersubjectivity or intercorporeality, as described by Merleau-Ponty. Then we have the passage from sharing to understanding others' perspectives that stabilizes around the age of 4 or 5. So our perception of others is not confined to primary intersubjectivity, because we can observe a transition from simple face-to-face meeting to what Baron Cohen described a mechanism of joint attention. The subject learns to understand the meaning of things, going from dyadic to triadic relations, or intersubjective situations involving the use of objects. And this level of intersubjectivity is beyond the mere encounter with otherness, and it implies imaginative and inferential capacities. So it's obvious that at the end of a comprehensive description of intersubjectivity, we cannot reduce it to a mental or abstract mechanism, nor to a mere focus on context. But primary and secondary intersubjectivity seems to be two phases of a single process, which includes sensory motor experiences, and contextual pragmatic imaginative abilities. And Fuchs noticed that we can also point out a tertiary intersubjectivity when infants begin to perceive others as intentional agents and they develop a self-other meta-perspective. So we can claim that intercorporeality is a multi-layered process which requires an integrated account consisting of several perspectives. So if we remind the schema offered from phenomenologists that I put at the beginning of the talk, we can claim that the autistic disorder seems to be a disorder that affects the social skills of the subject as early as the co-subjectivity, or as Zavi described it, open subjectivity. So already when I have to perceive an object, eroding inferential abilities and especially embodied interaffectivity. So the deficit can be identified, and here I'm talking about low functioning autism because it's a spectrum. It can be identified starting from primary intersubjectivity. So we can observe disturbances in sensory motor integration and imitative capacities, and as a result, secondary intersubjectivity, which involves the development of higher cognitive abilities, will find great difficulties. So to summarize, my understanding of this pathology is on three levels, the ones I mentioned before. So we have a pre-phenomenal level or neurobiological one, where we observe neurobiological disturbances. There are neural anomalies which make the subject unable to synthesize motor and kinesthetic information to one experience, and also an impaired assignment of the affective significance of stimuli. And these anomalies can be traced to the neural area which involves the mirror neural system. So they have problems in the so-called social brain, the social brain area. Then we have, from a transcendental perspective, a disorder of coherence, because we can register the lacking integration of these neural stimuli, which prevents the subject from forming a gestaltic, holistic perception. This is the same that we can find also in schizophrenia. But we also have at the phenomenal level, so at the level experienced by the subject, a disturbance of the embodied social perception due to a disruption, in my view, of this intersubjective self. So my thesis is that all of these dimensions could be synonymous with a disruption of our intercorporeality. So in other words, the phenomenological account of intersubjectivity can shed light on the fact that we are embodied and affective entities, and can also be helpful in distinguishing autism from other disorders such as schizophrenia and depression, as I was telling at the beginning. In these pathologies, the gap between self and other is due to different bodily disruptions. So in autism, we have a desynchronized body. In schizophrenia, we can observe a real disembodiment of the subject. So we have a fragmented self, and accordingly, the impossibility to cope with a social environment. While in depression, we have an hyper-embodiment. The body is so heavy that makes the subject a very heavy enclosed monad, unable to meet another person. So different causes, same result, a subjectivity incapable of relating at otherness, like in a shell, so a detachment from the social world. We can conclude, that one cannot be a self on one's own. So I hope that my perspective on autism today sheds light on the fact that our self is usually essentially dynamical, interpersonal, and is equipped with an implicit relational knowledge, an embodied intuitive knowing of how to interact with others, how to dance with others, which arises long before verbal communication. And I wanted to thank you for the attention and the patience, because I am aware that it was a very long presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Valerie. Yeah, your presentation has exceeded 8 minutes. Anyway, we started a little late as well, so I guess it is only 5 minutes late. Anyway, uh, yeah, so I thank you on behalf of Philosophy Department of Delhi University. So Dr. Valerie has summarized that how phenomenological account characterizes relation between self and other, and the very phenomenon of intersubjectivity, and how psychopathologies like autism, schizophrenia, and depression, they might be the result of disruption of this intersubjectivity. And she also discussed mirror neuron theory, which is a neurobiological explanation for autism. It is a basic explanation for our empathic relation with others. When we see others doing certain actions, we are able to understand their mentality, their intention behind those actions. And mirror neuron theory gives us an explanation. And as she informed us that in autism, these mirror neurons are probably disrupted. But yeah, Dr. Valerie, you said that this mirror neuron theory is not sufficient, or it is not the only, like we say, necessary and sufficient conditions. So you in your abstract, you have written that it is probably sufficient but not necessary, as I remember. So, so if it is not necessary, do you mean to say that there are some other biological processes which might be responsible for autism?
No, I said that it's, of course, it's necessary for our correct understanding, for our correct functioning, but it's not sufficient to account for the complexity of intersubjectivity. And also, I think that this is a very important point if we take into account mental pathology, because if we consider true a merely neural explanation in psychopathology, so if we claim, as some authors claim, okay, I am schizophrenia means that there is a certain region in the brain that does not work. So how can we cure this kind of disorder? Through pharmacology. This is very dangerous. So I think that as philosophers, we have also, in a way, the responsibility to claim no, intersubjectivity is something more. In this case, intersubjectivity, but also subjectivity in a sense.
So what will you I would like you to please explain us that what other than mirror neuron theory you would like to add to the story which explains autism?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I adopted this 3 layers account because I found it quite easy to work with. So of course, the neurobiological explanation is something we have to take into account. We cannot ignore that we also we have a brain, of course, and it's very important that it works very well. But I think that especially in understanding psychopathologies, what is important to take into account is also the sociocultural dimension and the subjective dimension. What do I mean? With the subjective dimension, I mean the domain of the lived experience. So what I call the phenomenal level of explanation. And I think I really believe that phenomenology can be really useful to this aim, because I think that in an analysis of psychopathological experiences, we need to take into account what does it mean to have schizophrenia? What does it mean to have autism? And luckily, there is a growing interest toward phenomenology from psychopathology. And I am thinking in particular to the work of Parnas, for instance, who developed together with other psychiatrists, one of them is Thomas Fuchs, phenomenological interviews, the ISE, so the examination of anomalous self-experiences, and the IWI, the examination of anomalous world experiences. And the aim of this interview is to collect first-person reports, so reports directly from the patients, where they do ask what does it mean to have autism? How do they feel towards these impairments, and so on and so forth. And these kind of interviews shed light on different on the structure of subjectivity, such as the perception of space, the perception of time, the perception of one's body and of others. So the structure of our subjectivity are at stake, of course, in psychopathologies. And we have to understand how the subject cope with them, how the subject feels towards these dimensions. So how space is perceived, how time is perceived. In depression, the time is perceived as an eternal present. We cannot see any future. And I think that this is important, for instance, in a therapy. The therapist should take into account how the subject is perceiving the world. And another dimension is, I think, the social-cultural one. So when a clinician meets a patient, he also has to figure it out is a story, is a social story, where and how he grew up, which kind of experiences can have an impact in the development of his subjectivity. And I think it's important that, for instance, also neuroscientists are starting to take into account these dimensions. At the beginning, I quote a recent paper by Vittorio Gallese, which proposes a biocultural paradigm. So neuroscientists themselves are arguing for the necessity of contextualizing the complexity of our subjectivity.
Right. Okay, so there are a couple of questions here. Dr. Singh wants to ask you. Dr. Singh, are you here? If you are here, you can directly ask your question.
I think I've already written what I wanted to ask, in the sense that I feel that maybe following her response, maybe I can add something.
Please.
Yeah. Can I answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I share with you the worry on the effectiveness of a phenomenological approach when what is at stake is interventions. So if we take into account therapies, there are no specific therapies which are merely phenomenological. I think it's very difficult to have it. One that is quite close to the phenomenological approach is the PhD model adopted by Giovanni Stanghellini, who is a psychiatrist, but basically his background is deeply phenomenological, and he developed this model of therapy which is based on phenomenology, hermeneutic, and dynamic therapy. I think that phenomenology can offer a great help if we take into account the understanding of the psychopathological dimension. This is the reason why I think that tools like a phenomenological interview or other hermeneutical tools can be crucial to change and to shift the mental health domain from a reductionist approach to a more complex, person-centered approach. For what concerns therapy, I am first of all, I am a philosopher and not a clinician, so I don't want to tell something crazy, but I am quite skeptical. I think that phenomenology can work as a methodological and hermeneutical support from therapies. So there are phenomenologically oriented.
Would you like to say that the phenomenologist will help us in understanding deeply about the problem at hand and in characterizing it more deeply?
Yeah.
Okay, there are a couple of other questions. So Suja Swaminathan is asking, can empathy itself cause disruption in self when not understood, reciprocated, or perceived by the other?
Yeah, I mean, empathy is a very difficult layer of intersubjectivity to be accounted for. I think that you are right in a sense, because I'm thinking about a specific theory on autism. There is one theory according to which autistic subjects do not lack empathy. On the contrary, they are hypersensitive and they have too much empathy, so they are overwhelmed by the feelings they are perceiving, or on the one hand they are not able to express their own feelings, so they are not reciprocated, we can claim. I think that we can have a disruption of affectivity in general. And it's very important to regulate our emotion. And this, of course, depends on many different factors, on of course, neurobiological mechanisms, but also on cultural issues and personal experiences. We can notice a disrupted empathy also in a person who suffered from trauma, from traumatic experiences. So also having too much empathy can be dangerous sometimes. This is the reason why I think understanding others also in a therapeutic context is important, because we need to contextualize others' experiences and understand why a person is behaving like this, or is not able to share her emotion, or not able to communicate her emotion.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria.
Next question is by Shivanshi Trivedi. Ma'am, if you are present here, you can ask directly, I guess. That would be more fulfilling. Shivanshi?
Yes, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Ma'am, I just wanted to know that is there any underlying need for the other? Apart from the social perspective, which causes certain disruptions in the self, is there any very essential need for the other in our own self-development?
Yeah, I think we can claim that there is a structural need for other, because we also recognize ourselves through we develop our personality through our meetings with others. So there is a personal layer, but also we can see how also from a developmental perspective the baby is essentially linked at the beginning, of course, to his mother, but also to the environment. There is a nice and funny experiment, the cat experiment. So there are newborn kitten, and some of them are put in a box for a couple of weeks. So they are alone in the box, and others are left free in a garden with the trees and so on and so forth. After a couple of weeks, the kittens that grew up with the possibility to engage in activities with others and environments are more developed than the one who grew up in the box, also from a brain perspective.
Yeah, this
So
was Heidenhain experiment. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. And ma'am, also, if we are to replace the cat in the box, for instance, with a human being, is there any possibility that within oneself, given the need of the other could be developed by the same person, like other within oneself?
Yeah, I deeply believe that the essential need for the other is something very innate. If we don't have this need, maybe this is something which is not working as in the autistic, as the autistic example shows us. Because in any case, also in the case where there is no chance or there is the impossibility to relate to otherness in a common way, there are compensatory strategies to relate to otherness. So from different side, I think that the situation is the same. So we are relational. Of course,
Okay.
if we take it from a phenomenological perspective.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, I have a small
lot.
question here in this connection. What will happen to a Tarzan? It's a fictional character, but if someone like Tarzan who is left alone in jungle and somehow it survives, then what will happen to his sense of self? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because you gave me the chance to quote and to go deep into Scheller's account of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Scheller gives the example of Robinson Crusoe, who was left in an island, and nonetheless he still feels the need to talk to someone else, and he creates his own Friday, his own mate. So according to Scheller, and from a phenomenological perspective, also in the case we are alone in a island and we grew alone in this island, we find a way to deal with the others, and we look for a sort of others, being it a human being or something very similar to another presence.
But my question was, what will happen to his sense of self?
And yeah, I think that, of course, his sense of self will be somehow disadvantaged in respect to people who grew up in a society like our society.
Anyway, there are other questions by Saurabh Todadia. Yeah, Saurabh, if you are here, you can directly ask.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Valeria, for the fascinating lecture. My question is basically that how do you see the relationship between the experience of disorientation at the body level, as we find in the many philosophy of health, the study of illness that is marked by the disorientation, and this narrative ability for a psychopathological embodied subjects whose, as you have rightly suggested, whose pre-reflective engagement has been disrupted. So does it also have the impact on the narrative structure?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, of course, there is a sort of gap between the felt dimension and the narrative one. This is, I think, the main problem of these interviews I was talking before, because in any case, they have to rely to the narrative dimension and not to the real phenomenal one, because we cannot grasp immediately what the other is experiencing. We have to rely on the narrative ability. And it's it's a question of faith. We have to trust. I personally collected reports from patients, from schizophrenic and from autistic patients, and it's very important to go beyond the mere narrative, and also to perceive again the subject as a whole, so also to take into account his bodily expressions, even if they are disrupted. It's an important sign in itself. But of course there is a gap between the experiential dimension and the narrative one, and I think that as these questions can also be linked to another important theme, that is the meaning making, because in each kind of pathology, patients, I don't like to use this expression, but so it's easy to understand, patients adopt a specific kind of making. So there is a need to attribute meaning to their experiences, and this is evident especially in schizophrenic patients. And schizophrenic patient can tell you wonderful and crazy stuff. So you have to rely a lot on the hermeneutical capacities of the interviewer, and also on this account of subjectivity as a whole. So we have to focus not only on what the subject is saying, so not only on the narrative dimension, but on the holistic dimension, so on the general expressiveness of subjectivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a question by Dr. Pankaj.
Can I just ask that?
Yeah, go ahead. If it is a short question, please, because there are other questions.
So do you see that phenomenological methodology is adequate to grasp this disruption of the narrative, or we go back to the Levinasian alterity?
Yeah, I think that Levinas's account is quite contemporary in this sense. There are some authors who are trying to focus on this narrative dimension, such as Anna Bortolan. And but I think that, of course, a gap between myself and the other remains. And this also pertains to in the psychopathological field. This pertains to the dimension of the so-called precox feeling. And this can be something meaningful in itself, because Tellenbach, but also other authors such as Otto Duerzegers, describes that even the fact that you as clinician are not able to immediately tune in with what the subject is telling, and you feel this very weird atmosphere, this is something very helpful for the clinician, and it's something that is also helpful for the process of diagnosis, so also to figure it out which exactly is the problem of the subject. So also a disruption or a difficulty in the narrative dimension can be something helpful to figure it out what's going on.
Okay, so here's a question by Dr. Pankaj. Pankaj, if you are here, you can directly ask, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Valeria, for this wonderful presentation. Really, it was interesting, and it seems to me that to engage this phenomenological approach, especially in pathological cases. But my hunch or my doubt is that when we are dealing with pathological cases, then we must have some methodological tools or systematic methods in that. Because when we are interacting in social world, that's very well, and we philosophers are doing such things. But when we are dealing with the patients or person with mental disorders, then for instance, I give you some example. For instance, in India, Ayurveda or homeopathy, we are engaging this kind of method of this, intersubjectivity or first person. But the problem is with these that, as someone may pointed out, that this narrative and all, history and all such things. But when you are invoking this phenomenological account, then what are the strict systematic methods? So would you like to say something on that?
Yeah. Okay. The trick is that a systematic methods does not exist in phenomenological psychopathology.
In other words, they are asking us that, so what if we don't study phenomenology, or what difference phenomenology is making in our understanding or finding some therapy? So in a way, they are asking the efficacy.
I really believe that phenomenology is very important for the study of psychopathology, and I think in the work of Jaspers has been an amazing psychiatrist. He wrote a masterpiece, General Psychopathology, Allgemeine Psychopathologie, when he was 28 years old, and he also took a degree in philosophy, especially in phenomenology. He studied with Kurt Schneider, who was again a psychiatrist, who also had a degree in philosophy and studied and wrote his dissertation under the supervision of Scheller. And this amazing psychiatrist who changed for a while. Unfortunately, then we had the Second World War with the terrible Nazi experiments and so on. But before, in Heidelberg especially, there has been this wonderful school of psychiatrists who deeply engaged in the question, what does it mean to be a subject? And they all have a phenomenological background. I don't think it's by chance. Of course, other philosophical tradition can be helpful, but I think that phenomenology really offers us important tools, such as the priority given to the pre-reflective components, the detailed description of the different layers of intersubjectivity. And I'm thinking here about Nature and Essence of Sympathy by Scheller, for instance, and an attention towards the subject of experiences of person. And I found it coherent also with contemporary clinical perspectives, such as the open dialogue. The open dialogue is, I don't know if you are familiar with it. I think it's amazing. Very shortly, it's a method which was quite recently born in Finland, and basically it does not rely on pharmacology. They use a short amount of pills, but they focus on dialogue with the patients and all the people around the patients. So they take into account his intersubjective environment. So they do interviews, they do colloquia with the subject, the patient, his family, his friends. And it's crazy because in Finland, the national health system adopted this kind of approach. And I think it can be a revolution. Now also in Portugal, they are starting to adopt open dialogue. And it's also quite similar to the Basaglia. Basaglia was an Italian psychiatrist who contributed to the end of the crazy houses, to hospital and for mental ill people, and it was for an understanding of an inclusive account of people who suffered from mental health. So yeah, I think that we need a polyphonic account of mental health and treatment.
Can you please repeat the name of these scholars? Freelander, you said? Can you please repeat the name?
The open dialogue.
How do you spell it?
I can.
Yeah, please write it here. Yeah, on the. Yeah.
Yeah. Open dialogue.
Open dialogue. But who is the person? I mean.
Jaakko.
Okay, open dialogue approach. Okay.
Finland. But also these are the main clinicians who are adopting this approach.
Okay, thanks for giving us these names.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so there are other Vinod, Shivaraj. Yeah, you can ask yourself, Vinod, if you are here. Vinod, are you with us? Okay, so yeah, if you can
you hear me? Hello.
Yeah. Okay, so he has joined with it. Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
You are audible.
Yeah.
Vinod?
Yeah. So, see, I've been working with few autistic kids quite for a while, and this question of mine, it popped just now, like a person with a distorted self, right? The reason being neuropathological. So, a person of that kind, I mean, is there any possibility from the external environment to create that intersubjective experience within that individual? I mean,
yeah.
Since we
Thank you.
talked about, so since we talked about
thank
this,
you for your question, because you gave me the chance to tell you about a specific therapeutic model developed for autistic children by Stanley Grispan and Serena Wieder in 1993, which is called Die-Er model, and which I changed into Die-IRE model. I will tell you why. So this model is based on development. So the fact that they take into account developmental psychology and so on and so forth, individual differences, and in this is very phenomenological because it takes into account the fact that we are unique individuals, and relationship-based model. So because we are essentially relational. I wrote a paper, you can find it easily online. It's quite consistent with my view, but it's more deeply. So if you are interested, you can find it about the DI model, because I added a voice on the role of embodiment. So what does this model suggest? It suggests that we have to elicit the autistic person's capacity to engage with another, especially by a technique called floor time. In this sense, they are all on the floor with the children, and they play together, and they try to elicit with the use of tools, objects, games, their sensory motor abilities. So they elicit them to interact and to play with tools, and it seems to be quite effective. So yeah, in this sense, because it enhances neural plasticity, as you hypothesize. So in this sense, the DIR model is one of the, I think, of the most effective therapy for autistic children.
Okay, thank you so much.
This, I guess, will also be consistent with embodied cognition approach, because in embodiment, we believe that our sensory motor experiences, they have a role in our cognition, in concept representation and other things. So yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess all of your questions are here exhausted, but there is one request from Shreya Mudgil. Can you please spell the name of theorists related to neurocultural paradigm?
Okay, okay. To the
Mhm.
neurocultural paradigm.
Yeah, if you
I
can
would
please.
say the first one is Vittorio Gallese.
Yeah.
He wrote wonderful things. Yeah. Yeah. It's if I find the paper because we host him this week in at the Leuven University with an online lecture, and he sent us this paper. I can send it to you by email. Maybe you can share it.
Yeah, sure. I will share it with others. Yeah, it will be helpful. So, are there any other questions?
I have a
So,
question.
yeah, please go ahead.
So I'm an autistic person, and I was wondering, is there any literature on self-perception of gender identity, along with this fractured sense of self and the social transaction that we are beholden to when we participate in a community. By the way, I'm not Soja Swaminathan. I'm her kid, just to clarify.
Yeah. Thank you. The issue of gender is a very important one, and there is a real gap in the literature. Actually, I think it's a shameful thing because usually autism is considered a male disorder, and there is this famous theory from Baron Cohen, which is indeed called the male brain hypothesis. And one of the reasons why I applied a couple of years ago for this grant to start studying in depth autism and collecting first person reports. One of the reasons I had a very long paragraph on the gender statement because usually there is a huge problem in the diagnostic process already because if girls have social problems, they are labeled as eating disorder. They think about probably she suffers from eating disorder, and this is something that makes me very mad, And I decided to study more autism from this perspective. So unfortunately, I cannot help you in finding literature in this respect, even though I have somewhere a list, and I can I will give you my email. I can share this with you if you want, if you are interested.
Thank you very much. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, because it's such an important issue.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, so I guess most of our listeners, they are quite satisfied, and it has been a rich discussion. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Me too.
Yeah. So I hope this is not end of our meetings. This is just a start, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It was very
and
nice to share.
yeah, and I share the concern of 2-3 of our listeners that this is often asked that what great significance you are going to make as from phenomenological perspective. I mean, in the accounts given by neuroscientists or psychologists for understanding or for giving therapy for autism, depression, and so on. But I share with you this understanding that to find a therapy, firstly we need to understand deeply, we need to characterize it properly, that what is the problem at hand. And I
Yeah.
think, yeah, so in that connection, I think phenomenology is of great help. to understand the structure of our experience with other, and when it is disrupting, then how psychopathology is being produced. So one interesting question, as Swaminathan, this Suja Swaminathan asked, that can self be damaged if it is not having good, it is not empathized well, as I got it, that if you are finding yourself that that there are not enough people who can empathize with you, then that can be self damaging. And probably one question which Vinod was asking, that can we repair the damaged self merely with the change of environment? I mean, without any medication, without any pharmacological treatment, because we understand it, a subject is understood in terms of environment, and what we know today as dynamical system theory. So subject is never to be understood separately from his or her environment, and environment includes both physical environment as well as social environment. So if someone is, say, depressed or having anxiety, and can we say that merely with a change of environment, maybe by putting him in isolation or some friendly environment, we can have some help to such person? So that was.
I mean, in the case, for instance, of course, each pathology has a degree of severity. In case, for instance, of melancholic depression, which is the most severe kind of depression, I believe that pharmacology it's necessary. But what I would like to emphasize through my contribution is that pharmacology is not enough. When we, of course, if we are schizophrenic, we need pharmacological help, but it's not enough in a sense. Once you the pills stop the symptoms, but the disorder is not only the symptoms. So if I stop hallucination, of course, I would be very relieved, but we need to go deep into the cause of the disruption. So pharmacology helps, and for certain pathologies, I cannot think about a therapy without a pharmacological support, but we need a comprehensive view and a comprehensive model of therapy. We cannot treat patient as a mere object to be treated. We need to support their understanding of the world, and in an active account of subjectivity, which takes into account also the environment, of course, can be helpful. And also change of environment, why not? Or group therapy or music therapy, they are very helpful.
Right. Okay, thanks, Valerie, for this wonderful session. I personally enjoyed it a lot. Okay, and I think our audience also learned a lot from this session. So I hope we will continue to have further interactions. Thanks a lot.
Me too. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.